I'm going to turn it over to Laurie Wayburn. Laurie, I'm thrilled to have you here. I probably get more questions about forests and how they fit into 30 by 30 than anything. And of course, forests are struggling right now. I mean, we're looking at the fires in Canada, and we experienced the same thing here. So well-managed forests are so important, and your work, I know, is critical to that. So as an introduction to the rest of you, Laurie Wayburn is co-founder and president of the Pacific Forest Trust. She's an accomplished forest and conservation innovator. She advises policymakers at the state, regional, national, and international level, and pioneers new approaches to develop sustainable resource economies using her deep experience in the fields of conservation, ecosystem services, and sustainability. Thank you so much for joining us today, Laurie. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. And I wish I made that kind of a set of preserves, but maybe Kay will give us all lessons, and then we can really blend preservation and conservation.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the chance to be part of this. And the Pacific Forest Trust is celebrating its 30th year. We are a thrice accredited land trust. Our goal, our mission, is to partner with private landowners to conserve and steward their well-managed lands in order to reweave that larger forest landscape that we all depend upon. We've conserved about 350,000 acres. We hold easements on about 110,000 acres of forest land. And we work in California, Oregon, and to some degree in Washington State. I wanted to talk today about how our active approach to conserving managed forest lands is so critical to both restoring and then conserving habitat for our amazing biodiversity here in California. So this is an example of that biodiversity. You have a cedar and an oak with a fissure in between them with that. So next slide, please. I'm going to focus my conversation on a particular area that we concentrate our activities in. That's the roughly 7 million acres that are the headwaters for the Sacramento River. And there's a very close link between water, biodiversity, and climate change and forests. So this region actually supports 80% of California's habitat types and already provides habitat for over 60% of our vertebrates. And you'll see there that there's a bit of a link already with the fact that these 7 million acres also provide the core of the state's utilized water. And is critical for San Francisco Bay and its habitats and species that rely upon that. And as Jen just mentioned, there's a very strong linkage between forests, climate change, and carbon. This region is also the most expandable carbon sink for the state in the near term. Next slide, please. The habitat context for this is that it's an extraordinarily diverse region. This is actually the most biodiverse conifer forest in the world. So it's globally recognized for that biodiversity. And that is derived from the fact that it has such an amazing suite of geologic and topographic features, from very little above sea level to 14,000 plus feet above sea level, with volcanics, metamorphic, sedimentaries. And so you have these high alpine lakes like Little Picayune Lake, and I included Picayune Lake because I just love to say the word Picayune. And then over to, in the McCloud River Basin, a rare pure stand of black oak. Obviously, these support a very different suite of biodiversity. And of course, there's everything in between. Next slide, please. So this is a key challenge that we face in this region. Public lands are roughly 62% of this landscape, and private lands are about 48%. As you see from the old USGS type map there, we've got a checkerboard, which means that, every 640 acres, and sometimes in small blocks within that, you can have a different management approach, and that can be extremely stressful for habitat function. On the right, you see what that can translate to on the landscape with, on private lands, pretty intensive management with a lot of disturbance, which can also be very disturbing for habitat function. And then the public lands, much less management, which also has its issues because much less management can translate to significantly overcrowded forests where fire has been suppressed historically. And we're now driving a lot of attention to reducing those fuel loads because this habitat overall, this suite of habitats within this region, historically are shaped by fire, both indigenously driven fire and naturally occurring fire. So it's a fire adapted region from which we have excluded fire, and we're now having to work to reintroduce that in a safer way. But critical for wildlife is that those little squares on a map mean absolutely nothing. A clear-cut opening will mean something, but squares on a map don't. And so a key goal of our conservation easements is to conserve and then restore on ongoing management the little white patches, which are the privately owned lands there. And this is right outside of Dunsmuir, Castle Crags area, and that's I-5 running through the side of the slide. Next slide, please. So our working forest conservation easements with private landowners are a really adaptable, flexible tool that we apply. And I wanted to share two examples with you. One is at a more family level on 3,600 acres, relatively high on the shoulder of Mount Shasta. You can see from the picture on the right, part of Butte Creek Meadows. That's 600 acres of really critical wet alpine meadows. It's a source of Butte Creek, which flows eventually into the Klamath River. But this is an area where when wolves first returned to California, this is where they came. It has Cascade frog, snowshoe hare, which is a highly endangered species because it can only go so high, silver-haired bat, and many, many others. On the left, you can see how we approach conservation easements, and that is that we establish different kinds of management zones across the area covered by that conservation easement in order to best protect and focus management for those habitat characteristics. So within this 3,600, you'll see a big chunk for the wet meadow area. There's also some much older forest, which has special management terms associated with it. And then there's matrix lands and more. I want to flag that these are very adaptable tools so that you can target your restrictions to what you want to achieve on the landscape. Now, in this particular easement, they do run cattle in the summer, and is part of a traditional pattern that's been practiced actually in many areas of the world, which is that in the winter, cattle are in the lowlands, and in the summer, they're in the higher wet meadows. And this is done compatibly with sandhill cranes as well as these wolves. So a really remarkable family and a remarkable landscape. That's a very tailored approach there. And I'd like to share another example where this is in a more financially managed landscape. Next slide, please. And this is a 13,000 acre conservation easement with an industrial owner known as a Timber Investment Management Organization. So their primary goal here is less about legacy, and it's more about managing this land for financial return, as well as creating a legacy that others will benefit from. And within this, there is not cattle grazing, but it is for timber production. So you can see here, more of the land is in this matrix color, that kind of lighter green. And I want to flag that there are restrictions within the matrix that are really focused not just on these special habitats, which are the different colors, but within the matrix, management is designed to allow and foster and encourage and create older, more natural stand conditions. So greater diversity of species, much larger trees with minimums of 30 inches and above. And so that you get both the matrix and these special habitat zones of springs and meadows and so on. 127 species are supported here, of which 17 are special status. And it's really quite diverse with 14 different habitat types on it. This feeds into Squaw Creek, which then feeds in turn into the McCloud. These easements are designed with performance goal about what management is to achieve over time, and they require a management plan which is updated every 10 years to reflect the changing conditions on the properties. Next slide, please. So one of the key things about conservation easements is that they're designed to last forever. And as we know, our climate is changing, and therefore what kind of habitat is provided on the landscape is changing. And one of the challenges for all of us in this field is, what is the value of this conservation over time for biodiversity? One of the key reasons that we work in this particular area is that it is projected to be refugia for more species in California than any other area. So we, with funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board, developed a model to analyze what this changing condition looks like on the landscape, working with the global change models. Worked with UC Davis and Duke University on that. So what you see here is a set of static maps that show how this region changes over time. This is on a particular project. It's an 11,000 acre project in the Trinity headwaters. Next slide, please. And what this shows is that by 2100, this region will be pretty darn stable. So that means that the habitat services that it provides today will be the habitat services that it provides tomorrow, but it is also welcoming in a suite of species that are moving upwards from lower elevations into higher elevations where it will be cooler and where there's more water available. And one of the things that I wanted to flag with this is that by having a permanent conservation easement on these lands, we can ensure that management and restoration continues to provide that welcome mat well into the future. Next slide. So this is just a pretty slide to give you an indication of some of the species that are there, the Townsend's bat, the willow flycatcher, and the cascade frog. With that. And we were very grateful to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy for making a grant to this at the same meeting that Kay just mentioned recently. Next slide, please. This is just a little wake-up call about what 2100 is supposed to look like in this overall region. You can see that the lower elevations get extremely hot. And that means that it's going to be very difficult to maintain the current habitat functions there at the broader scale in those areas. So that's a big motivator for us to really scale up conservation through this 30 by 30 pathway effort. And just how important it is to conserve more on the landscape so that our amazing biodiversity has a place to move to and a place to live. Last slide, please. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, because people benefit enormously from this, whether it is by providing them the long-term place in which to do resource management, or for us to all benefit from the water and other biodiversity services that this land provides. Thank you.